There's a haunting emptiness in the air tonight, a void where humor once thrived, where satire once flourished, where the freedom to mock power once stood as a pillar of democratic expression. ABC studios will remain silent on matters that demand our attention, not because there's nothing to say, but because fear has crept into the boardrooms of corporate America. The machinery of entertainment has ground to a halt under the weight of political intimidation. And what we're witnessing isn't just the cancellation of a television program. It's the systematic dismantling of free speech in the land that once championed it above all else. The chain of events that led us to this dark moment began when a media conglomerate chose submission over principle. Pressured by governmental powers and influenced by commissioners who should protect broadcasting independence, ABC made a choice that will echo through history. They silenced a comedian whose only crime was exercising the very freedom that generations of Americans fought and died to preserve. The trigger? Commentary about public reactions to a controversial incident involving a political figure named Charlie Kirk. The response? A coordinated effort to eliminate a voice from the airwaves. At precisely 4 minutes past 8 in the evening, a message appeared on social media that should send chills down every American's spine. The occupant of the highest office in the nation took to his keyboard to celebrate what he termed wonderful developments for the country. His words dripped with vindictive satisfaction as he announced the termination of Jimmy Kimmel's broadcast. He congratulated the network for discovering what he called courage, though true courage would have meant standing firm against precisely this kind of pressure. His statement mocked the comedian's abilities, disparaged his viewer numbers, and compared him unfavorably to other late-night hosts. The message didn't stop there. It extended threats toward other networks, specifically targeting NBC with emphatic punctuation that betrayed an almost childlike fury. This communication came from a man holding the most powerful position in the free world, and yet his priorities seemed strangely petty, disturbingly personal, shockingly vindictive. In an era fraught with genuine crises demanding presidential attention, economic uncertainties, international tensions, domestic challenges, this individual chose to dedicate his energy and the weight of his office toward crushing a comedian. The pettiness is staggering, but the implications are terrifying. History provides us with a measuring stick for presidential behavior, and by that measure, we've fallen catastrophically far. Consider the presidency of Richard Nixon, a man whose name became synonymous with corruption, whose administration collapsed under the weight of scandal, who resigned in disgrace to avoid impeachment. Even Nixon, at his most paranoid and vindictive, never attempted what we're witnessing today. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show throughout Nixon's presidency, crafting jokes at the president's expense night after night. Nixon fumed privately, complained bitterly, but never once did he leverage federal power to silence Carson. Never once did he demand networks fire entertainers who dared to criticize him. No previous American president, not one, has threatened corporate entities with such brazen disregard for constitutional principles. The current occupant of the White House has shattered norms we thought were unbreakable. He represents the first chief executive in American history to essentially nationalize portions of private enterprise. Just weeks ago, his administration acquired a 10% ownership stake in Intel, a privately held technology corporation. This move represents a throwback to failed Soviet-era economic policies, the kind of governmental overreach into private markets that both major political parties traditionally opposed. Historically, Republicans championed free market capitalism and resisted governmental interference in business operations. Democrats, while supporting stronger regulations, equally recognized the superiority of private enterprise over state control. This consensus held for generations. But something fundamental has shifted. Democrats maintain their commitment to these principles. They haven't attempted to seize control of private corporations. They haven't demanded that companies or educational institutions hire or terminate specific individuals based on political considerations. The same cannot be said for the current Republican leadership, which has abandoned decades of conservative economic philosophy in favor of authoritarian market manipulation. The echoes of history are impossible to ignore. During the 1950s, Senator Joe McCarthy launched his infamous crusade against alleged communist infiltration in government. Other Republican lawmakers extended this witch hunt into the entertainment industry, targeting Hollywood with accusations and innuendo. The film industry, gripped by terror, responded with the blacklist, a shameful chapter where executives compiled lists of artists, writers, and directors who would never work again because of their political beliefs or associations. Fear drove these decisions. Corporate executives lacked the courage to stand against political pressure, choosing self-preservation over principle. This historical cowardice isn't surprising to anyone who studies American corporate behavior. Businesses have rarely demonstrated moral courage when confronted with threats from those wielding governmental power. So we shouldn't be shocked when contemporary corporations bend their knees before political intimidation. What should shock us, what should shake us to our core, is that the United States of America now has a president who behaves this way. Never before have we witnessed a commander-in-chief who directs federal commissioners to attack broadcasting networks simply because they employ individuals who criticize him. Never before have we seen a president who views comedic commentary as a threat requiring governmental response. And yet, here we are. For years, there's been a recognition that late-night comedians often provide the most effective analysis of certain political developments. On countless occasions, serious journalists have stepped back from particular stories, recognizing that satirists like Seth Meyers, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, or Jimmy Kimmel could capture the absurdity, the irony, the sheer ridiculousness of events in ways that traditional reporting cannot. Comedy cuts through spin and sophistry. Satire exposes hypocrisy. Humor reveals truth that straightforward journalism sometimes struggles to convey. These comedians became essential voices in political discourse precisely because they could say what others couldn't, laugh at what deserved mockery, and humanize complex issues through the universal language of comedy. Johnny Carson's 3-decade tenure hosting The Tonight Show provides stark contrast to our current reality. From 1962 through 1992, Carson presided over late-night television through 7 different presidential administrations. During those 30 years, entire months would pass without Carson telling a single joke about whoever occupied the White House. Why? Because most presidents, most of the time, weren't inherently funny. They were serious people doing serious work, commanding respect, even from those who disagreed with their policies. Citizens could disagree profoundly on political questions while still maintaining baseline respect for the office and its occupant. When Carson did joke about presidents, it was typically brief, a single quip before moving on to other topics. An unwritten rule governed his writer's room: never include more than 3 political jokes in any monologue. Carson believed that exceeding this limit would bore his audience. Political humor had to be deployed sparingly because politics itself was fundamentally boring to most Americans. They tuned in for entertainment, not partisan commentary. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the luxury of finding politics boring. How old must someone be to remember when American political life seemed mundane, when elections came and went without existential drama, when policy debates felt technical rather than apocalyptic? For those old enough to recall that era, there's a deep nostalgia for that boredom. They were right to find it boring. That boredom signified stability, normalcy, functional governance. Today, we have the opposite: a president who is himself a perpetual source of comedy material, not by choice, but by nature. His behavior, his statements, his decisions provide endless fodder for satirists. He has become unavoidable for anyone attempting nightly comedy about current events. The absurdity is simply too rich, too constant, too overwhelming to ignore. But he despises being the punchline. He cannot tolerate mockery. He views humor at his expense as personal attack requiring retaliation. And so, as the microphones of professional comedians are systematically silenced, the humor takes on darker tones. The jokes become less about laughing together and more about laughing nervously in the face of creeping authoritarianism. We should be horrified by these developments. Yet anyone familiar with American corporate history recognizes the predictable pattern. When businesses face genuine threats of governmental interference, particularly the quasi-socialist market manipulation we're now witnessing, they typically capitulate. Courage is rare, principle is expensive. Self-preservation wins. The president wants us fixated on the Kimmel cancellation. He craves that attention. He demands we spend our time debating his power to silence critics, demonstrating his strength to supporters, generating outrage that confirms to his base that he must be doing something right if so many people are angry. Cable news has largely obliged, dedicating hours to exactly the discussion he desires. There's value in that outrage. It's important, it's justified, it's necessary, but it's also exactly what he wants. So instead of giving him that satisfaction exclusively, let's examine what he desperately doesn't want discussed. Let's look beyond the distraction to the deeper scandals he hopes will be forgotten in the noise. As mainstream broadcasters silence professional comedians through corporate intimidation, something interesting happens. Grassroots satire fills the void. Street artists, guerrilla comedians, independent voices rise up to do the work that corporate media won't. In London, where the president recently traveled for a state visit, protesters employed brilliant satirical tactics. They projected images onto Windsor Castle itself, images of the president alongside Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex trafficker. They displayed what appears to be a birthday greeting bearing the president's signature sent to Epstein. This projection onto the historic castle where the president was being hosted represented protest with a distinctly British flavor of irreverent humor. The timing of this visit is worth examining. Months earlier, when the British government scheduled this elaborate diplomatic flattery campaign designed to soften the president's position on tariffs, Jeffrey Epstein wasn't yet dominating headlines as a political liability. The crimes Epstein committed had been known for years, but they hadn't yet become the president's specific problem. However, those same crimes had already brought scandal to Windsor Castle long before this visit. The current British monarch has a younger brother named Andrew, who maintained close friendships with both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's co-conspirator in sex trafficking. Virginia Giuffre filed a lawsuit accusing Andrew of sexual assault, which he settled rather than face trial. Like most royals throughout history, Andrew proved spectacularly inept at managing public criticism. In a catastrophically ill-advised decision, he agreed to a television interview intended to clear his name. Instead, it destroyed whatever reputation he had left. When asked whether he regretted his friendship with Epstein, Andrew's response revealed a staggering moral bankruptcy. He stated that he didn't regret it because the people he met and opportunities he gained through Epstein were actually very useful. That's how he characterized his relationship with a sex trafficker and abuser of children. Even in 2019, years after Epstein's crimes were publicly known, Andrew viewed him primarily as a networking opportunity. The consequences for Andrew, while real, were laughably inadequate. He was demoted from a ceremonial position that wasn't a real job to begin with. He retained his prince title, but was essentially told to do nothing, which is what he'd always done anyway, since royalty rarely does anything productive. The punishment for associating with a child rapist and sex trafficker: keep doing nothing, but more officially. Don't attend certain family gatherings, continue living in luxury and privilege while officially having no responsibilities. The British monarch desperately wanted to keep the Epstein stain far from his family and his castle. Andrew was deemed too compromised to sit at important tables. Yet because of the president's economically disastrous tariff policies, the British government concluded that flattery might succeed where principle wouldn't. They invited the American president to London, rolled out royal pomp and ceremony, and seated him at tables where Andrew is no longer welcome. Here's the bitter irony. Jeffrey Epstein never publicly claimed to be Andrew's closest friend. But in a recorded interview with journalist Michael Wolff, Epstein explicitly stated, "I was Donald's closest friend for 10 years. So the British monarch, trying to distance his family from the Epstein scandal, has now invited someone with potentially deeper Epstein connections than his own disgraced brother. Andrew is banned from the table. The president sits in the seat of honor. The absurdity deepens. Peter Mandelson, who served as British ambassador to the United States, was supposed to attend this state dinner. He was present when the invitation was extended in the Oval Office. But just last week, Mandelson lost his position because of Jeffrey Epstein. Bloomberg published emails from 2008 between Mandelson and Epstein, sent after Epstein's guilty plea in a sex trafficking case. In these messages, Mandelson wrote, "I think the world of you and I feel hopeless and furious about what has happened. I can still barely understand it. It could not happen in Britain." This was written the day after Epstein began serving his extraordinarily lenient sentence in Florida, a sentence that allowed him to leave custody during the day to work at his office, returning only at night to sleep in a facility. Mandelson expressed sympathy and confusion. He claimed such injustice could not happen in Britain. Well, perhaps not in exactly that way. In Britain, apparently, the consequences for associating with sex traffickers are that the king simply ensures you do nothing for the rest of your privileged life. So the British government's attempt to manipulate the American president through flattery has spectacularly backfired, placing their monarch at the center of the Epstein scandal he wanted to avoid. The president sits at the royal table while the ghosts of Mandelson and Andrew hover metaphorically in the corners, reminders of connections to crimes that should disqualify anyone from such honors. Back in Washington, another theater of the absurd played out in the House Judiciary Committee. The president's FBI director, arguably the most incompetent person to ever hold that position, appeared for routine oversight questioning. Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican, systematically dismantled the director's evasive testimony from his Senate appearance the previous day. Massie had watched the Senate hearing where the FBI director, Kash Patel, was asked about Epstein trafficking victims. Patel claimed there was no credible information that Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. He blamed limited search warrants from 2006-2007 and a non-prosecution agreement for hampering investigations. Massie pointed out the obvious flaw in this reasoning. Those constraints only applied to the Southern District of Florida. They didn't restrict the Southern District of New York, which brought sex trafficking indictments against Epstein in 2019. Those proceedings produced extensive FBI documentation, specifically FD 302 forms detailing victim testimony. According to these documents in FBI possession, victims identified at least 20 men to whom Epstein trafficked them. The list included Jess Staley, the CEO of Barclays Bank, and at least 19 others. A Hollywood producer worth hundreds of millions, a royal prince, a prominent music industry figure, a major banker, a high-ranking government official, a former politician, an Italian automotive company owner, a rock star, a magician, and at least 6 billionaires, including one from Canada. These names exist in FBI files. The Bureau knows exactly who they are. Massie demanded to know whether any investigations had been launched, whether Patel had even reviewed these victim statements. Patel's response was a masterclass in evasion. He claimed to have asked agents to review files and bring forward credible information. He insisted that multiple U.S. attorneys' offices across 3 administrations had reviewed these materials and found them insufficient. But when pressed on whether he personally reviewed the FD 302 documents where victims named their abusers, he couldn't provide a straight answer. Massie exposed the absurdity. How could Patel sit before the Senate and claim there were no names when FBI files contained detailed victim testimony identifying numerous perpetrators? Patel's response that he'd named one person that day was laughably insufficient. The FBI director's strategy for keeping his job apparently involves playing the role of a wisecracking tough guy in congressional hearings, adopting a swagger that might work in movies but falls flat when questions demand straightforward answers. Then came the most damning exchange. Massie asked directly, "Did you tell the president that his name appears in the Epstein files?" Patel claimed he'd never discussed the Epstein files with the president. When asked if he'd informed the Attorney General that the president's name was in those files, Patel launched into vague references to multiple conversations about the files generally. Massie persisted with laser focus. "Did you tell the Attorney General that the president's name is in the Epstein files? Yes or no?" Patel dodged repeatedly, offering non-answers, deflections, everything except a simple yes or no. When told to spell it out clearly, he continued evading. When pressed again for a straightforward answer, he claimed the question had been asked and answered, which it hadn't been. Massey's conclusion was devastating. You have not answered it, and we will take your evasiveness as a consciousness of guilt. And there it is. The FBI director, appointed by a president who celebrates silencing comedians, cannot or will not answer whether he informed his superiors that the president's name appears in files related to one of the most notorious sex trafficking cases in American history. His evasion speaks volumes that his words refuse to articulate. This is where we find ourselves. Comedians silenced through corporate intimidation, presidents celebrating their power to crush critics, corporate America cowering before authoritarian threats, and law enforcement leadership unable to provide straight answers about investigations involving the most powerful people in the nation. The joke has indeed become darker. What was once funny has become frightening. What should shock us has begun to feel normalized. And that normalization is perhaps the greatest danger of all. When comedy dies, when satire is silenced, when humor becomes dangerous, we're left with only the raw truth, and that truth is terrifying. America has entered uncharted territory led by a president who views free speech as a threat to be eliminated rather than a right to be protected. The laughter has stopped, but the danger has only begun.